Jake Morrison sat in his rusty pickup truck outside the unemployment office, staring at the rejection letter in his hands. Another dead end, another door slammed shut. The paper crumpled as his fist tightened around it. 3 months ago, he had been one of the best ranch hands in all of Montana. Now he was just another guy with calloused hands and no place to go. The morning sun beat down through his cracked windshield. As he counted the money in his wallet for the third time that day, $47.32. That was all that stood between him and sleeping in his truck again tonight. His stomach growled, reminding him that the stale donut from yesterday was the last real meal he could remember. Jake had always been a proud man. Growing up on his grandfather's small farm, he learned early that hard work and honest living would take care of everything else. But life had other plans. When the big corporate ranch where he worked for 8 years decided to cut costs, Jake found himself out of work along with 12 other good men. The ranch owner barely looked up from his paperwork when he handed out the pink slips. The apartment Jake had been renting came next. Mrs. Patterson, his elderly landlord, had been patient for 2 months. She even brought him soup a few times when she knew he was struggling. But patience only stretched so far, especially when her own bills needed paying. The eviction notice came on a Tuesday. Jake had until Friday to find somewhere else to go. He drove through town that morning, looking at the familiar sights with new eyes. Everything looked different when you knew you might not see it again. The diner where he used to grab breakfast before work. The feed store where all the ranchers gathered to talk about weather and cattle prices. The small church where his mother used to drag him every Sunday before she passed. All of it felt like it belonged to someone else now. Jake pulled into the parking lot of Murphy's General Store and sat there for a moment, working up the courage to go inside. He needed to buy a newspaper. Not for the job listings, he had already called every ranch within 100 miles. He needed the classified ads section, specifically the cheap housing rentals. Maybe he could find a room somewhere or a couch to rent by the week. The bell above the door jingled as he walked into the store. Old Murphy looked up from behind the counter and nodded. They had known each other for years, but Jake felt too ashamed to make conversation. He grabbed a newspaper from the rack and headed to the counter. The paper cost 75 cents. Jake laid out 3/4, and Murphy pushed them back across the counter. "On the house today?" the old man said quietly. "Take care of yourself, son." Jake nodded his thanks, not trusting his voice to stay steady. Back in his truck, Jake spread the newspaper across his steering wheel and turned to the classified section. Most of the rentals required first and last month's rent up front. Even the cheapest room wanted $200 just to move in. His $47 looked even smaller on the page. Then something caught his eye in the corner of the page. It was a tiny ad, barely 3 lines long, squeezed between a listing for used farm equipment and someone selling puppies. Ranch property for sale, $10 cash only, immediate possession, serious inquiries only, call Bill. There was a phone number scratched below it. Jake read the ad 3 times, $10. It had to be a mistake. Maybe it was supposed to say 10,000 and the newspaper had messed up the printing. But the ad clearly said $10, and right now, $10 was something he could actually manage. He walked back into Murphy's store and asked to use the phone behind the counter. Murphy nodded toward it without asking questions. Jake dialed the number with shaking fingers. A gruff voice answered on the second ring. "Yeah? Hi, I'm calling about the ranch property in the paper. The one for $10? There was a pause. "You serious about buying or just wasting my time?" "I'm serious. I have the money." "Good. Name's Bill Henderson. I'm handling this for the county. Property's been sitting empty for 20 years, maybe more. County just wants it off their books." "You got a pen?" Jake scrambled for a pencil from Murphy's counter. "Yeah, go ahead." Bill rattled off an address that meant nothing to Jake, followed by directions that seemed to lead into the middle of nowhere. "Property's 40 acres, more or less. House needs work. Well, might need work too. Sold as is, no warranties, no guarantees. You break it, you bought it. $10 cash, and you handle all the paperwork yourself." "What kind of paperwork?" Transfer of deed, property taxes, whatever the county wants. Not my problem once you buy it. You coming today or not? I got other things to do. Jake looked at his wallet again. $10 would leave him with $37 and change. Not enough for a security deposit anywhere, but maybe enough for some basic supplies if this ranch thing was real. I'll be there in 2 hours. Make it an hour and a half. I don't like waiting around. The line went dead. Murphy had been listening to the whole conversation while pretending to sort through receipts. You sure about this, Jake? Sounds too good to be true? Everything else has been too bad to be true lately, Jake replied. Maybe it's time for the opposite. The drive took longer than expected. Bill's directions led Jake down increasingly rough roads until he wondered if he had made a wrong turn somewhere. The pavement gave way to gravel, then to dirt, then to something that was barely a road at all. His truck bounced and rattled over potholes and rocks. Finally, he saw a figure standing next to a beat-up sedan beside a rusty mailbox. The man looked to be in his 50s, wearing a wrinkled shirt and a baseball cap. He was smoking a cigarette and checking his watch with obvious irritation. You Jake? The man called out as Jake parked. That's me. Bill Henderson, you got the money? Jake pulled out his wallet and counted out 10 $1 bills. Bill took them without counting and stuffed them into his shirt pocket. Then he reached into his car and pulled out a folder with some papers inside. This here's your deed, Bill said, handing over a single sheet of paper. Property starts at that fence post there and goes back about a quarter mile. House is through those trees. Like I said on the phone, sold as is. County don't care what you do with it as long as you pay the property taxes. They're about $60 a year, in case you're wondering. Jake looked at the paper. It was covered in legal language he didn't understand, but his name was written at the bottom, along with a description of 40 acres in the middle of nowhere. That's it? No inspection or anything? Mister, for $10, you get what you get. County's been trying to get rid of this place for years. Consider yourself lucky. Bill tossed his cigarette on the ground and got back in his car. Welcome to the wonderful world of property ownership. As Bill's car disappeared down the dirt road, Jake stood alone next to his truck, holding a piece of paper that said he now owned 40 acres of Montana wilderness. For the first time in months, something that felt like hope stirred in his chest. It might not be much, but it was his. And sometimes having something that was yours was enough to start over. Jake stood in the settling dust from Bill Henderson's car, staring at the hand-drawn map on the back of a greasy napkin. The directions looked like something a kid might scribble during a boring math class. Follow dirt road past 3 cattle. Guards, turn left at dead tree, keep going until you see the house. That was it. No street names, no landmarks that made any sense, just scratches on a napkin. That supposedly led to his new home. He climbed back into his pickup truck and studied the map again. The first cattle guard was easy enough to find, a metal grate, stretched across the road about half a mile from where Bill had left him. The truck bounced as he drove over it, and Jake could hear his few belongings rattling around in the bed behind him. Everything he owned fit in 2 duffel bags and a cardboard box. The second cattle guard appeared after another mile of increasingly rough road. Jake's truck wasn't built for this kind of terrain, but it was holding up better than he had expected. The third cattle guard was harder to spot, partly hidden by tall grass that hadn't been cut in years. As he drove over it, Jake noticed the landscape was changing. The rolling hills gave way to flatter ground, and the few scattered trees looked older and more weathered. Finding the dead tree took longer than he thought it would. The road forked in 3 different directions, and Jake had to get out of his truck twice to look for anything that resembled a dead tree. Finally, he spotted it, a massive old oak that had been struck by lightning sometime in the past. Its blackened trunk split down the middle, but still standing like a monument to better times. The left turn took him onto what could barely be called a road anymore. It was more like 2 tire tracks with grass growing between them. Jake had to slow down to avoid the worst of the potholes, and his truck groaned as it climbed over rocks and fallen branches. He started to wonder if Bill Henderson had played some kind of cruel joke on him. Maybe there was no ranch at all, just an endless dirt road leading nowhere. But then he saw it. Through a gap in the trees, Jake caught his first glimpse of what was supposed to be his new home. His heart sank. The house looked like something out of a horror movie. It was a 2-story wooden structure that might have been white once, but was now a patchwork of gray weathered boards and peeling paint. The roof sagged in the middle like an old horse's back, and several windows were missing their glass entirely. Jake parked his truck next to what used to be a front gate and got out slowly. The silence was complete except for the wind moving through the tall grass. No cars, no people, no sounds of civilization at all. Just him and 40 acres of forgotten Montana wilderness. He walked closer to the house, stepping carefully around. Holes in the ground and pieces of rusted metal. The front porch tilted at an angle that defied physics, held up by wooden posts that looked like they might collapse if he sneezed too hard. Weeds grew up through the floorboards, and a family of birds had built a nest in the corner where the roof met the wall, but as Jake walked around the property, something started to feel wrong. Not dangerous wrong, just ... off. For a place that was supposed to have been abandoned for 20 years, there were signs that someone had been here recently. The weeds near the front door had been trampled down, creating a clear path to the steps. A small garden plot behind the house showed neat rows where vegetables had been growing. Though they were now brown and wilted from the early frost, Jake noticed other things too. Fresh tire tracks in the mud near what looked like an old barn. A pile of recently chopped firewood stacked against the side of the house. And most puzzling of all, a thin line of smoke rising from the chimney. He stood perfectly still and watched. As smoke curled up into the gray sky, someone was inside his house. Someone had been living here, taking care of the place, making it home. Bill Henderson hadn't mentioned anything about current residents. In fact, he had been very clear that the property was abandoned. Jake's mind raced through possibilities. Maybe it was just some homeless person who had found shelter here. Maybe it was teenagers using the place as a hangout. Or maybe Bill Henderson had lied about the whole thing, and Jake had just bought someone else's home right out from under them for $10. He walked back to his truck and leaned against the tailgate trying to figure out what to do next. The legal paper in his pocket said this was his property, but the evidence in front of him suggested otherwise. The smart thing might be to drive back to town and find Bill Henderson, demand some answers. But Jake didn't have gas money for another trip, and besides, where would he sleep tonight if not here? As he stood there debating with himself, Jake noticed more details about the property. The 40 acres stretched out in all directions, mostly flat grassland with clusters of trees scattered here and there. In the distance, he could see the remains of old fence posts and what might have been a cattle pen at one time. This had been a working ranch once, probably a pretty good one. Near the house, Jake found the remnants of other buildings. A barn that was in better shape than the house, though its red paint had faded to a rusty brown. A smaller building that might have been a chicken coop. Even an old outhouse, complete with a crescent moon carved in the door. The well was the most encouraging discovery. It sat about 50 yards from the house, covered by a wooden shelter that looked sturdy enough. Jake lifted the cover and dropped a pebble into the darkness below. The splash came back clear and quick, suggesting there was plenty of water down there. At least he wouldn't die of thirst, but the smoke from the chimney kept drawing his attention back to the house. Whoever was inside had to know that a truck had pulled up outside. They had to have heard him walking around, exploring their domain. Yet no one had come out to investigate. No face had appeared at any of the windows. It was like they were waiting for him to make the first move. Jake walked to the front steps and tested them with his weight. They creaked and groaned but held firm. The front door was made of heavy wood that had weathered to a silver-gray color. There was no doorbell, just a simple brass knocker that had turned green with age. He reached for the knocker, then stopped. What was he supposed to say? "Hi, I just bought your house for $10 and I need you to leave?" It sounded ridiculous even in his head. But this was his property now, according to the piece of paper in his pocket. He had every right to be here. The shadows were getting longer as afternoon moved toward evening. Jake needed to make a decision soon. He could sleep in his truck again, but the nights were getting colder and he didn't have enough gas to keep the heater running. The house might be falling apart, but it had walls and a roof and apparently a working fireplace. He took a deep breath and knocked 3 times on the door. The sound echoed through the house like gunshots. Then he waited, listening to his own heartbeat and wondering what he would find on the other side of that door. The 3 knocks on the door seemed to echo forever through the old house. Jake stood on the creaking porch, shifting his weight from one foot to the other, listening to the silence that followed. Maybe nobody was home after all. Maybe the smoke he saw was just leftover heat from a fire that had burned out hours ago. Then he heard footsteps. They were slow and deliberate, moving across what sounded like wooden floors inside the house. Jake's mouth went dry. This was really happening. Someone was actually living in his $10 ranch. The footsteps stopped just on the other side of the door, and Jake could feel someone watching him through the PEEPHO. The silence stretched on for what felt like an hour but was probably only 30 seconds. Jake raised his hand to knock again. But before his knuckles could touch the wood, he heard the sound of multiple locks being turned. 1, 2, 3 different deadbolts clicked open from inside. The door swung inward with a long, drawn-out creak that belonged in a haunted house movie. Jake found himself face to face with an elderly Native American man who looked like he had stepped out of an old Western photograph. The man's hair was completely gray, braided and hanging past his shoulders. His face was deeply lined with wrinkles that spoke of decades spent outdoors under the Montana sun. He wore a simple flannel shirt and jeans that had seen better years. But what caught Jake's attention immediately was the double-barrel shotgun the man held across his chest. Not pointing at Jake exactly, but not pointing away from him either. The message was clear without any words being spoken. The 2 men stared at each other for a long moment. Jake tried to think of something to say, but his brain had apparently stopped working. This wasn't how he had imagined his first day as a property owner would go. Finally, the older man spoke. His voice was calm and steady, with just a hint of an accent that Jake couldn't quite place. "You're standing on sacred ground, young man? I suggest you turn around and go back where you came from." Jake's hand instinctively went to his back pocket where he kept the deed. "I'm sorry, sir, but I think there's been some kind of mistake. I just bought this property. I have the paperwork right here." The man's expression didn't change. If anything, his grip on the shotgun seemed to tighten slightly. "Papers don't mean much when they're built on lies. This land has been in my family for generations, long before any white man ever set foot here." Jake slowly pulled out the crumpled deed and held it up so the man could see it. "Look, I don't want any trouble. I bought this place fair and square from the county." They said it was abandoned. For the first time, the man's stern expression showed a flicker of something else. Sadness, maybe, or resignation. He looked at the paper in Jake's hand but didn't reach for it. "The county has been trying to get rid of this place for 15 years. I should have known they'd eventually find someone desperate enough to take it." "Desperate enough?" Jake felt his face flush with embarrassment. "I'm not desperate. I'm just looking for a fresh start." The man studied Jake's face for a long moment, taking in his worn clothes, his beat-up truck, and probably the desperation. Jake thought he was hiding so well. "What's your name, Fresh Start?" "Jake Morrison." "Well, Jake Morrison, my name is Thomas Crowfeather, and I've been living on this land for the past 15 years, taking care of it, protecting it from people who would destroy it for profit." Thomas shifted the shotgun to one arm and gestured toward the surrounding property. "You see abandoned land. I see the bones of my ancestors." Jake looked around at the overgrown fields and tumble-down buildings, trying to see what Thomas saw. All he could see was 40 acres of potential and a house that needed a lot of work. "Your ancestors?" "My great-great-grandfather was born in that grove of trees over there," Thomas said, pointing toward a cluster of old oaks about 100 yards away. "His father is buried on the hill behind the barn. This land has been sacred to my people since before your people ever crossed the ocean." The weight of Thomas's words settled on Jake like a heavy blanket. He had thought he was buying abandoned property, but apparently he had stumbled into something much more complicated. If this land belongs to your family, why was the county selling it? Thomas let out a bitter laugh. Same reason the government has been taking our land for 200 years. They have bigger guns and better lawyers. He paused and looked directly into Jake's eyes. How much did you pay for 40 acres of prime Montana ranch land? Jake felt even more embarrassed now. $10. $10. Thomas repeated the words like they tasted bad. They sold my ancestors' homeland for the price of a cheap lunch. The two men stood in uncomfortable silence, both trying to figure out what came next. Jake could feel his dreams of a fresh start crumbling around him. Thomas obviously had a much stronger claim to this land than some piece of paper Jake had. Bought for $10, but where did that leave him? He had nowhere else to go and no money to go there with. Look, Mr. Crowfeather, Jake said finally. I didn't know any of this when I bought the place. If I had known, I never would have. I mean, I'm not trying to steal anyone's land. Thomas studied Jake's face again, looking for signs of deception. Whatever he saw there seemed to satisfy him because he lowered the shotgun slightly. You seem like a decent enough young man, but decent doesn't change the fact that you're standing on my front porch, holding a paper that says you own my home. What if we figured something out? Jake asked, surprising himself with the words. I mean, this place is big enough for two people, isn't it? Thomas raised an eyebrow. You're suggesting we share the land? I'm suggesting maybe we both got screwed over by the same system, Jake said. You've been taking care of this place for 15 years, and they sold it out from under you for $10. That's not right. For the first time since opening the door, Thomas's expression softened slightly. Most white men would have called the sheriff by now, tried to have me arrested for trespassing. Most white men probably have somewhere else to go, Jake replied. I spent my last $10 on this place. If I can't make it work here, I'll be sleeping in my truck for the winter. Thomas looked at Jake's rusty pickup truck, then back at Jake himself. Something in the young man's honesty seemed to reach him. You really are desperate, aren't you? Pretty much, yeah. Thomas was quiet for a long moment, thinking. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost some of its hardness. The sun's getting low, and it's going to be a cold night. You can't fix this mess in the dark. He stepped back from the doorway. You might as well come inside. We can figure out what to do with you in the morning. Jake hesitated. Are you sure? I don't want to impose. Young man, you just bought my house for $10. I think we're a little past worrying about imposing. Thomas turned and walked into the house, leaving the door open behind him. Jake stood on the porch for another moment, trying to process everything that had just happened. Then he grabbed his duffel bag from the truck and followed Thomas inside, wondering what other surprises his $10 investment was going to bring. Jake stepped into the house and immediately felt like he had walked back in time 50 years. The inside was nothing like what he had expected from looking at the rundown exterior. While the outside showed decades of neglect, the interior had been carefully maintained. The wooden floors were swept clean, and someone had obviously spent time repairing the worst damage. The living room was simple but comfortable. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, with a small fire crackling inside that filled the room with warmth. Two mismatched chairs sat facing the hearth, and handmade rugs covered the floor. The walls were decorated with what looked like Native American artwork, beautiful paintings and weavings that brought color to the otherwise plain room. Thomas gestured toward one of the chairs. Sit. You look like you're about to fall over. Jake realized he was exhausted. The stress of the day, combined with weeks of poor sleep and irregular meals, had caught up with him all at once. He sank into the chair gratefully and felt some of the tension leave his shoulders for the first time in hours. Thomas disappeared into what Jake assumed was the kitchen and returned a few minutes later with 2 steaming mugs. Coffee, he said, handing one to Jake. Real coffee, not that instant garbage. The coffee was strong and black, and it tasted better than anything Jake had drunk in weeks. As he sipped it, he looked around the room more carefully. Everything showed signs of careful maintenance and attention. This wasn't the home of someone who was squatting on abandoned property. This was the home of someone who had been building a life here for years. "You've done a lot of work on this place," Jake said. Thomas settled into the other chair. 15 years of work. When I first came here, you couldn't walk through half the rooms without falling through the floor. The roof leaked like a sieve, and animals had made nests in every corner. Why did you choose this place? Thomas stared into the fire for a long moment before answering. I didn't choose it. It chose me. He took a sip of his coffee. My people. The Crow Nation, they didn't always make the best decisions about our heritage. There was pressure to sell things, to compromise, to forget the old ways in favor of progress and money. Jake waited quietly, sensing that Thomas was sharing something important. I was what you might call a troublemaker, Thomas continued. When the tribal council decided to sell some of our most sacred artifacts to museums and collectors, I spoke out against it. I said we were betraying our ancestors for tourist dollars. They didn't appreciate my opinion. What happened? They exiled me, cast me out from the tribe. Said I was living in the past and holding everyone back from a better future. Thomas's voice carried old pain. I was 62 years old, and suddenly I had no home, no family, no place in the world. Jake tried to imagine what that must have. Felt like, bad as his own situation was, at least he had made his own choices that led him here. Thomas had been rejected by his own people for trying to protect their traditions. How did you end up here? I spent 2 years wandering, working odd jobs, sleeping wherever I could find shelter. Then one day I was driving through this area and saw this place. It was worse than abandoned. It was forgotten. But something about it called to me. Thomas gestured toward the windows. I did some research at the library in town. Found out this land used to be part of Crow territory back before the government treaties carved everything up. Your family actually lived here? My great-great-grandfather, Standing Bear, was born in the grove of oak trees out there. The burial ground on the hill behind the barn holds 5 generations of my family. When the soldiers came in 1884 to force U.S. onto the reservation, Standing Bear refused to leave. They shot him right there by the front gate. Jake felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. They killed him for refusing to leave his own land? Different times, Thomas said simply. But not so different that the government stopped taking our land. They just found more creative ways to do it. The 2 men sat in silence for a while, listening to the fire crackle and the wind moving through the trees outside. Jake was beginning to understand the weight of what he had stumbled into. This wasn't just about 2 men claiming the same piece of property. This was about generations of injustice and a man trying to honor his ancestors' memory. What happened to the artifacts? Jake asked. The ones your tribe wanted to sell? Thomas's expression darkened. Most of them ended up in private collections or museums hundreds of miles away. Sacred items that had been passed down for centuries, reduced to curiosities for tourists to gawk at. The money from the sales went to fund a new casino. Do you regret speaking out? Every day, Thomas admitted. But I also know I couldn't have lived with myself if I had stayed quiet. My grandfather taught me that some things are more important than being comfortable or accepted. Jake thought about his own grandfather, who had taught him the value of hard work and honest living. He wondered what the old man would have said about this situation. Your grandfather sounds like a wise man. He's the one who taught me the stories about this land, about our family's connection to it. Before he died, he made me promise to find a way back here someday, to make sure our ancestors weren't forgotten. Is that why you've been taking care of the place? Thomas nodded. I consider myself the guardian. I maintain the burial sites, keep the spirits company, make sure developers don't turn sacred ground into a shopping center or a housing development. Jake felt a growing respect for the older man. Thomas had sacrificed everything to honor his family's memory and protect something he believed in. It was the kind of principled stand that Jake admired but had never been brave enough to make himself. What about you? Thomas asked suddenly. What brought you to my doorstep with $10 and a desperate look in your eyes? Jake found himself telling Thomas the whole story. About losing his job at the ranch, about the eviction notice, about counting his last $47 in the parking lot outside Murphy's store. He told him about the newspaper ad that seemed too good to be true, and about Bill Henderson, who sold him 40 acres of land like he was getting rid of an old couch. Thomas listened without interrupting, nodding occasionally. When Jake finished, the older man was quiet for a long moment. "So we're both men without homes," Thomas said finally. "Both betrayed by systems that promised us fair treatment." "Seems that way. The difference is you have a piece of paper that says you own this place." Jake pulled the deed out of his pocket and looked at it. After hearing Thomas's story, the document felt like a cruel joke. "I don't feel like I own anything. I feel like I bought stolen property." "You probably did," Thomas said matter-of-factly. "The question is, what are you going to do about it?" Jake stared into the fire, thinking about everything Thomas had told him. The smart thing would be to find a lawyer, figure out his legal rights, and claim what he had paid for. But something about that felt wrong now. This wasn't just about ownership, it was about justice and history, and honoring the people who had lived and died on this land long before either of them was born. "I don't know," Jake said honestly, "but I know I can't just kick you out and pretend none of this matters." Thomas smiled for the first time since Jake had met him. "That's more than most people would say." Outside, the wind was picking up, and Jake could hear it whistling through the gaps in the old walls. Winter was coming, and both men knew that. Their temporary truce wouldn't survive the harsh months ahead unless they found a real solution to their impossible situation. Jake woke up the next morning on Thomas's couch with a crick in his neck and sunlight streaming through windows that needed cleaning. The smell of bacon frying in the kitchen reminded him that he hadn't eaten a real meal in 2 days. His stomach growled loud enough to wake the dead. Thomas appeared in the doorway holding 2 plates of eggs, bacon, and toast. "Figured you might be hungry," he said, handing Jake a plate. "We need to get this land situation figured out today." Over breakfast, they made a plan. Jake would drive into town and visit the county courthouse to research the property's history. Thomas would stay at the ranch and gather any documents he had collected over the years. They agreed to meet back at the house that evening and compare what they had learned the drive to town gave Jake time to think about everything Thomas had told him the night before. The story about Standing Bear being shot at the front gate kept playing in his mind. Jake had always known that Native Americans had been treated badly in the past, but hearing about it from someone whose family had actually lived through it made it feel more real and more personal. The county courthouse was an imposing brick building that looked like it had been built around the same time the land was first taken from Thomas's ancestors. Jake climbed the stone steps and pushed through heavy wooden doors into a lobby that smelled like old paper and floor wax. A helpful clerk named Dorothy pointed him toward the records office in the basement. "Property records go back to 1875, she explained as they walked down a narrow staircase. "Everything's organized by section and township numbers." "What are you looking for exactly?" Jake showed her the deed Bill Henderson had given him. Dorothy studied it for a moment, then led him to a wall of filing cabinets that stretched from floor to ceiling. "This should be everything for your section. Good luck." Jake spent the next 4 hours digging through dusty files and faded documents. What he found made his head spin. The 40 acres had changed hands more times than he could count. Sold for taxes in 1923, foreclosed on in 1934, seized by the government in 1943 for some kind of military use that never happened. Sold again in 1956, 1967, and 1981, each time. It seemed like someone had bought the land with big plans that never worked out, but the most troubling discovery came when Jake found documents from the 1880s. The original survey maps clearly showed that the land had been designated as part of the Crow Nation Reservation under an 1851 treaty. Then, just 3 years later, a new survey moved the reservation boundaries, and the 40 acres were suddenly classified as unoccupied government land available for homesteading. Jake stared at the contradictory documents spread across the table. According to the 1851 treaty, the land belonged to the Crow Nation. According to the 1884 survey, it was government property. Both documents bore official seals and signatures, but they told completely different stories. He gathered up the most important papers and walked back upstairs to find Dorothy. "Can you help me understand something?" he asked, showing her the conflicting documents. Dorothy put on her reading glasses and studied the papers carefully. "Oh my," she said after a few minutes. "This is quite a mess, isn't it? What does it mean?" "Well, legally speaking, it means the ownership of this property has been in dispute for over 100 years. The treaty should have protected it, but the later survey essentially voided the treaty without any legal process." Jake felt his heart sinking. "So my deed isn't valid?" "I wouldn't say that exactly. You have a legal deed issued by the county, so you're an innocent purchaser. But if someone can prove a prior claim based on the original treaty—" Dorothy trailed off and shook her head. "You really should talk to a lawyer about this." "I can't afford a lawyer." Dorothy thought for a moment. "There's a legal aid clinic downtown that helps people with low incomes. They might be able to point you in the right direction." The legal aid clinic was located in a converted storefront between a pawn shop and a Chinese restaurant. A hand-painted sign in the window advertised "Free legal advice, walk-ins welcome." Jake pushed through the door and found himself in a cramped waiting room filled with folding chairs and outdated magazines. The receptionist, a college-aged woman with kind eyes, took down Jake's information and told him someone would see him within the hour. Jake sat down next to an elderly woman who was clutching a stack of medical bills and muttering under her breath about insurance companies when his name was finally called. Jake followed a young woman into a tiny office that was barely large, enough for a desk and 2 chairs. She introduced herself as Linda Walsh, a recent law school graduate who volunteered at the clinic twice a week. Jake spread the documents across Linda's desk and explained the situation. She listened carefully, taking notes and asking questions about how he had purchased the property and what Thomas had told him about his family's history. "This is fascinating," Linda said when Jake finished his story, "and incredibly complicated. From what you're showing me, there are at least 3 different legal theories that could apply here." "3? First, you have a valid deed from the county, which gives you legal title as an innocent purchaser. Second, there's the original treaty claim, which could give Mr. Crowfeather's family ancestral rights to the land. Third, there's the possibility of adverse possession." Jake had never heard that term before. "What's adverse possession?" "It means that if someone has been living on and maintaining property openly for a certain period of time, they can sometimes claim legal ownership, even without a deed. In Montana, I think the requirement is 5 years, but Mr. Crowfeather has been there for 15. Jake's head was spinning again. "So who actually owns the land?" "That's what a court would have to decide. But here's the thing, this kind of case could take years to resolve, and it would cost tens of thousands of dollars in legal fees." "I spent my last $10 buying the place." Linda nodded sympathetically. "Most people in your situation can't afford to fight a case like this. That's probably why the county was able to sell it so cheaply." They knew there were title problems, but they also knew that anyone willing to pay $10 for 40 acres probably couldn't afford to hire lawyers. Jake felt anger building in his chest. "So they screwed both of us. They sold me land they knew I might not actually own, and they did it after letting Thomas live there for 15 years. Unfortunately, that's probably exactly what happened. Government agencies do this more often than you might think. They get tired of dealing with problem properties, so they dump them on unsuspecting buyers and let the courts sort it out later. What are my options?" Linda leaned back in her chair and considered the question. "Legally, you could file a lawsuit to establish clear title. But like I said, that would be expensive and time-consuming. You could also try to negotiate some kind of agreement with Mr. Crowfeather, maybe a shared ownership arrangement. Or I could just walk away. That's always an option. You'd lose your $10, but you'd avoid years of legal headaches." Jake gathered up the documents and thanked Linda for her time. As he walked back to his truck, he thought about what she had said. Walking away would be the smart thing to do. Cut his losses and start over somewhere else, but where would he go? And what about Thomas? The old man had already lost his home once when his own tribe cast him out. How could Jake be responsible for him losing it again? The drive back to the ranch gave Jake time to think about his limited options. He could fight for legal ownership and probably win, leaving Thomas homeless. He could walk away and let Thomas keep the land, leaving himself homeless. Or he could try to find some kind of middle ground that neither of them would be completely happy with, but both could live with. When he pulled up to the house, Thomas was sitting on the front porch holding a cardboard box. "How did it go in town?" he asked as Jake climbed the steps. "About as bad as we expected," Jake replied. "What's in the box?" Thomas opened it to reveal a collection of old photographs, letters, and official documents. 15 years of paperwork. Every time the county sent me a notice to vacate, every time they tried to auction the property, every time a developer came sniffing around, I kept it all. Jake sat down in the other porch chair and looked through the documents. There were dozens of legal notices, all addressed to current occupant or trespasser. There were letters from Thomas to various government officials, explaining his family's connection to the land and requesting recognition of his ancestral rights. There were even a few responses from bureaucrats, most of them form letters that basically said, "Not our problem." "You've been fighting this battle for 15 years?" Jake asked. "Fighting and losing," Thomas replied. "But at least I was still here. My ancestors are still here. That counted for something." Jake pulled out one of the letters Thomas had written to the Bureau of Indian Affairs. It was beautifully written, explaining the history of the land and Thomas's family's connection to it. The response was a 2-sentence form letter saying that the matter was outside their jurisdiction. "This is unbelievable," Jake said. "They just ignored you for 15 years? Government agencies are very good at ignoring inconvenient truths," Thomas said, "especially when those truths involve admitting they made mistakes in the past." The sun was setting behind the oak trees, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. Jake woke up on his third morning at the ranch to the sound of hammering coming from somewhere above his head. He rolled off the couch and stumbled to the window, looking up to see Thomas on the roof with a handful of shingles and a mouthful of nails. "What are you doing up there?" Jake called out, his voice still thick with sleep. Thomas pulled the nails from his mouth and looked down. "Fixing the leak over the kitchen before the next storm hits. Unless you prefer your morning coffee with a side of rainwater." Jake grabbed his boots and jacket and climbed up the ladder Thomas had leaned against the side of the house. The view from the roof was incredible. 40 acres of rolling grassland stretched out in every direction, broken up by clusters of trees and the winding line of a creek that Jake hadn't noticed before. "Hand me that tar paper," Thomas said, pointing to a roll sitting near the edge of the roof. As they worked together replacing damaged shingles, Jake found himself relaxing for the first time in weeks. There was something satisfying about fixing things with his hands, about making something better instead of watching everything in his life fall apart. Thomas worked with the confidence of someone who had been maintaining this place for years. But he was patient with Jake's questions and willing to teach him the best way to nail down shingles. "You know," Jake said as they took a break to drink some water, "I never thanked you for letting me stay here." "Where else were you going to go?" Thomas replied. "Besides, this place is too big for one person. Gets lonely sometimes." "How lonely?" Thomas was quiet for a moment, looking out over the land. 15 years without family, without anyone to share the stories with. Sometimes I go weeks without talking to another human being. The closest neighbor is 8 miles away, and they think I'm some kind of crazy hermit. Jake tried to imagine what that kind of isolation would do to a person. He had felt alone plenty of times in his life, but never completely alone. There had always been coworkers or neighbors, or at least the people at Murphy's store to exchange a few words with. "What do you do all day?" "Take care of the land, maintain the burial sites, keep the spirits company." Thomas gestured toward the hill behind the barn. "My ancestors are patient, but they don't like being ignored." After they finished with the roof, Thomas led Jake to the burial ground he had mentioned. It was a small hill covered with old oak trees, peaceful and quiet except for the sound of wind moving through the leaves. Most of the graves were marked only with simple stone cairns, but a few had wooden markers with names and dates carved into them. "This is Standing Bear," Thomas said, stopping next to a larger cairn near the center of the site. "My great-great-grandfather, the one who was shot for refusing to leave." Jake knelt down and touched one of the stones. He had never been particularly religious, but there was something about this place that felt sacred, like it deserved respect. "And quiet voices. Do you come here often?" "Every morning and every evening. I tell them about the day, about what's happening in the world, about the people who remember them." Thomas sat down on a fallen log and looked around at the graves. They had been patient with me living in their shadow. "I just hope they understand why I've been fighting so hard to stay." They spent the afternoon winterizing the house, stuffing newspaper into gaps around the windows and checking the wood supply for the fireplace. Thomas had been stockpiling firewood for months, and the pile against the side of the house was taller than Jake. Clearly, the old man knew what he was doing. When it came to surviving Montana winters, while Thomas went to check on something in the barn, Jake decided to explore the house more thoroughly. Most of the rooms on the second floor were empty except for dust and mouse droppings, but one room at the end of the hall caught his attention. The door was slightly ajar, and Jake could see sunlight streaming through a window inside. He pushed the door open and stepped into what must have been the master bedroom when this was a working ranch. It was larger than the other rooms, with windows on 2 walls and a stone fireplace in the corner. But what made Jake stop and stare was the condition of the walls. Someone had carefully removed sections of the interior wall, revealing the original wooden framework of the house. It looked like construction work, but it was too neat and precise to be random demolition. Jake ran his fingers along the exposed beams and noticed something strange. There were papers tucked into gaps between the boards, like someone had hidden them there deliberately. "Thomas," Jake called out, "you need to come see this." Thomas appeared in the doorway a few minutes later, slightly out of breath from climbing the stairs. When he saw what Jake was looking at, his expression changed to one of excitement. "I've been working on this room for 2 years, Thomas explained. "Something my grandfather told me when I was young. He said the original owner of this house, the man who built it after they forced my people off the land, he hid important papers in the walls. I've been looking for them ever since I moved here." Together they carefully extracted papers from various hiding spots throughout the room. Most of them were too damaged by age and moisture to read, but a few were still legible. There were old receipts, personal letters, and what looked like business records from the 1880s, but the real treasure was a leather folder, tucked deep into a gap near the fireplace. Inside were several documents that made both men sit down hard on the dusty floor. The first was a letter from a government land agent named William Harrison, dated 1884. It was addressed to someone named Robert Morrison, possibly Jake's own ancestor, given the shared last name. The letter explained that Morrison was being offered the 40 acres in exchange for his cooperation in resolving certain difficulties with the local Indian population. "Cooperation in resolving difficulties," Jake read aloud. "What does that mean?" The second document made it clear. It was a sworn statement from Robert Morrison, describing how he had assisted federal marshals in the removal of hostile Indians from government land. The statement was signed and notarized with an official government seal at the bottom. Thomas studied the document carefully. "Your ancestor helped them force my ancestor off this land." Jake felt sick. "I'm sorry, I had no idea." "You weren't." "There," Thomas said quietly. "But it explains a lot about why the land title has been so confused all these years." The third document was the most shocking of all. It was a copy of the original 1851 treaty, but this version had handwritten notes in the margins. Someone had marked the boundaries of the Crow Nation territory and written calculations about how much land could be reclaimed for productive use. "They planned the whole thing," Jake said, reading the notes. "They signed the treaty knowing they were going to break it." "Government promises to Indians have always had expiration dates," Thomas replied. "But having proof of their intentions, that's something different." As the afternoon turned to evening, They spread all the documents across the kitchen table and tried to piece together the story they told. It was a tale of deliberate deception, with government agents promising land to white settlers while simultaneously promising the same land to native tribes. When the inevitable conflicts arose, the government sided with the settlers and blamed the Indians for being hostile. "Your great-great-grandfather Standing Bear," Jake said, looking at one of the letters. He wasn't shot for refusing to leave. He was shot because he had proof that the government was breaking their own treaty, Thomas nodded grimly. He was trying to protect his family's legal rights. That made him dangerous to people who had already promised the land to someone else. The room grew quiet as both men absorbed the implications of what they had found. These papers didn't just explain the confusion about who owned the land. They provided evidence of a deliberate conspiracy to steal it from its original owners. "What do we do with this?" Jake asked. Thomas picked up the treaty copy and studied the handwritten notes. "We make sure the truth doesn't stay hidden in these walls for another 100 years. Outside, the wind was picking up again, rattling the windows, and reminding them that winter was coming whether they were ready or not. But for the first time since Jake had arrived, both men felt like they had something solid to build on. The truth might be complicated and painful, but it was still better than the lies they had been living with. "You know what this means, don't you?" Thomas said as they gathered up the papers. "What?" "Neither of us owns this land legally. Your deed is based on a fraudulent sale, and my family's rights were stolen through a conspiracy. Technically, this property still belongs to the Crow Nation under the original treaty." Jake thought about that as he helped Thomas secure the papers in a safe place. It should have been devastating news, finding out that his $10 investment was completely worthless. But somehow it felt more like relief. He and Thomas weren't enemies fighting over the same prize anymore. They were allies uncovering a truth that was bigger than both of them. Linda Walsh stared at the documents spread across her small desk with the kind of expression lawyers get when they realize they're looking at something much bigger than they expected. She had asked Jake and Thomas to meet her at the legal aid clinic after they called her about their discovery, but nothing had prepared her for what they brought in that cardboard box. "These are incredible," she said for the third time, carefully turning over the treaty copy with its damning handwritten notes. "Do you understand what you found here?" Jake and Thomas exchanged glances. They had spent 3 sleepless nights, going through every piece of paper they had pulled from the walls, trying to understand the full scope of what they had uncovered. "We think we found proof that the government deliberately broke their own treaty," Thomas said. "It's more than that," Linda replied, pulling out a magnifying glass to examine the official seals more closely. "This isn't just evidence of treaty violations. This is documentation of a systematic conspiracy to defraud Native Americans of their legal rights. These papers could rewrite the history books." She leaned back in her chair and looked at both men seriously. "But they could also make you some very powerful enemies. Are you prepared for that?" Jake had been asking himself the same question for days. A week ago, his biggest worry was finding enough money for gas. Now he was sitting in a lawyer's office, discussing government conspiracies and historical fraud. What kind of enemies? "Think about it," Linda said. "If these documents prove that the original land seizure was illegal, it doesn't just affect your 40 acres. There could be thousands of acres in this region that were taken through the same fraudulent process. That's millions of dollars in current land values," Thomas nodded grimly, "and a lot of powerful people who wouldn't want to give it back." Linda spent the next hour making copies of every document and taking detailed photographs. She explained that she would need to research similar cases and consult with attorneys who specialized in Native American land rights. But she warned them that the legal process could take years and would certainly attract unwanted attention. "There's something else you should know," she said as they prepared to leave. "Word is already getting around town about your situation. Someone saw you at the courthouse last week, and people are starting to ask questions." Sure enough, when Jake and Thomas drove back to the ranch that afternoon, they found a black SUV parked near the front gate. 2 men in expensive suits were walking around the property, taking pictures and making notes on clipboards. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" Thomas called out as he and Jake got out of their truck. The taller of the two men approached them with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Good afternoon. I'm Richard Wells from Mountain Vista Development. This is my associate Gary Price. We understand there might be some interest in selling this property." Jake felt his stomach tighten. "Who told you that?" "Word gets around in a small town," Wells replied smoothly. "We're always looking for properties with development potential, and this location could be perfect for our next project." Thomas stepped forward, his jaw set. "This land is not for sale." "Well, that's where things get interesting," Wells said, pulling out a folder. "We've done some research on the ownership situation here, and it seems like there might be some complications with the title. We're prepared to offer a very generous sum to resolve those complications quickly and quietly." He handed Jake a piece of paper with a number written on it. Jake looked at it and felt his knees go weak. It was more money than he had ever seen in his life. Enough to buy a house, start a business, live comfortably for years. "We're offering the same amount to Mr. Crowfeather," Wells continued, "in recognition of his emotional attachment to the property. Everyone walks away happy, and we can put this land to productive use." Thomas took the paper from Jake and tore it in half, without looking at the number. "Our ancestors are buried on this land." "You can't put a price on that." Wells's smile faded slightly. "Mr. Crowfeather, I understand your feelings, but you have to be realistic. This property has been tied up in legal disputes for over a century. Our offer would allow you to purchase a nice piece of land somewhere else, maybe closer to your tribal community." "I was banished from my tribal community for fighting to protect our heritage," Thomas replied coldly. "I'm not about to abandon." "And now for your shopping center or golf course or whatever you're planning?" "Actually," Price spoke up for the first time, "we're planning a luxury resort and spa. Very respectful of the natural environment. We could even include a small memorial to acknowledge the historical significance of the site." Jake found his voice. "A memorial to the people you'd be kicking off their own land?" "Mr. Morrison," Wells said, turning his attention to Jake, "you seem like a practical man. You paid $10 for this property. We're offering you a return of over 1,000,000% on your investment. Surely you can see the wisdom in accepting our offer." The number was tempting, Jake had to admit. More money than he had ever dreamed of having. But as he looked around at the land Thomas had spent 15 years protecting, at the hill where Standing Bear was buried, at the house where they had uncovered the truth about a century-old conspiracy, he realized that some things couldn't be bought. "The land isn't for sale," Jake said firmly. Wells's expression hardened. "Gentlemen, I think you're making a mistake. There are other ways to resolve property disputes, and not all of them are as friendly as what we're offering today." "Is that a threat?" Thomas asked. "It's a reality check," Wells replied. "This property is going to be developed one way or another. You can be part of the solution, or you can be part of the problem. But either way, this land is too valuable to sit here producing nothing but memories." After the developers left, Jake and Thomas sat on the front porch and watched the sun set behind the oak trees. The encounter had shaken both of them more than they wanted to admit. "How did they know about the legal complications?" Jake asked. "We haven't told anyone except Linda." "Small towns have big ears," Thomas replied. "Plus, if they're serious about developing this area, they've probably been researching property ownership for months. Do you think they'll try to cause trouble?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment. "Developers like that don't take no for an answer easily. They've probably already spent money on surveys and environmental studies. Walking away from a deal this size would cost them a lot." That night, Jake lay on the couch staring at the ceiling and thinking about the offer. $1,000,000 would solve every problem he had ever had. He could buy a real house, start a business, never worry about money again. All he had to do was walk away from 40 acres of disputed land and an old man who had nowhere else to go. But every time he closed his eyes, he saw Standing Bear's grave marker and thought about Thomas sitting alone on this land for 15 years, keeping faith with ancestors who had been betrayed and forgotten. Some things were worth more than money, even a lot of money. The next morning brought more visitors. This time it was a reporter from the local newspaper, followed by a crew from the regional television station. Someone had leaked the story about the hidden documents and the evidence of government conspiracy. By noon, there were more cars parked along the dirt road than Jake had seen since he arrived. "Mr. Morrison, Mr. Crowfeather!" A young woman with a microphone pushed through the crowd gathered near the front gate. "Is it true that you found evidence of treaty violations dating back to the 1880s? Thomas looked at Jake, and Jake could see the fear in the older man's eyes. This was exactly what they had hoped to avoid, turning their quiet fight for justice into a media circus. "No comment," Jake said, but the reporters kept shouting questions. "Are you planning to sue the federal government? What's your response to the development company's claims that you're blocking economic progress? Mr. Crowfeather, how does it feel to be fighting for land your ancestors owned?" The attention continued for 3 days. Reporters camped out along the road, filming every time Jake or Thomas left the house. The story spread to national news websites with headlines about Native American land rights and historical injustice in Montana. Supporters began showing up, some from nearby reservations, others from environmental groups and historical preservation societies, but the supporters weren't the only ones taking notice. On the 4th day, Jake found a notice taped to the front door. The county was ordering an immediate inspection of the property for health and safety violations. Thomas received a separate notice informing him that he was being investigated for illegal occupation of government property. "They're fighting back," Thomas said as they read the notices. "Let them," Jake replied, surprising himself with his determination. "We've got the truth on our side now." The battle lines were drawn. On one side were Jake and Thomas, armed with historical documents and a growing network of supporters. On the other side were government agencies, development companies, and people who had spent over a century profiting from stolen land. It was going to be a fight that would determine not just who owned 40 acres in the middle of Montana, but whether justice could ever truly be served for crimes committed in the past. The federal courthouse in Helena looked like a fortress, with its massive stone columns and steps that seemed to go on forever. Jake adjusted his tie for the 10th time as he and Thomas climbed those steps together, followed by Linda Walsh and a team of volunteer lawyers who had joined their case after the story went national. 6 months had passed since they first discovered the hidden documents in the farmhouse walls. 6 months of legal briefs, depositions, media interviews, and sleepless nights, wondering if they were fighting a battle they could never win. The government had thrown everything they could at Jake and Thomas, building code violations, tax assessments, even an attempt to declare the property a health hazard, but somehow they had survived it all. "You ready for this?" Linda asked as they paused at the courthouse entrance. Thomas looked up at the carved words above the doorway. "Equal justice under law." He let out a bitter laugh. "My people have been waiting for equal justice for over 100 years. What's one more day?" Inside the courtroom, Jake was amazed by how many people had come to witness the hearing. The gallery was packed with reporters, tribal representatives, historians, and supporters who had been following their story. But he also noticed the other side, lawyers in expensive suits representing the government. The county and Mountain Vista Development. Judge Catherine Reynolds took her seat behind the bench and surveyed the crowded courtroom with the kind of stern expression that made everyone sit up straighter. She was known as a fair but tough judge who didn't tolerate nonsense from either side. "This is quite an unusual case," Judge Reynolds began. "We have conflicting claims to the same piece of property based on events that happened over 140 years ago. But the evidence presented suggests that those historical events may have broader implications for land ownership throughout this region." Linda stood up to present their case first. She walked the judge through the documents they had found, explaining how the handwritten notes on the treaty copy proved that government officials had planned to violate their own agreements from the very beginning. "Your Honor," Linda said, holding up the original letter from the government land agent, This correspondence shows that Robert Morrison was given the land not through any legitimate purchase, but as compensation for helping federal marshals remove Native Americans from their legal territory. This was not a sale, it was a payoff for participating in an illegal land grab. The government's attorney, a sharp-faced man named David Chun, argued that the documents were too old to be relevant in modern court proceedings. Your Honor, these alleged historical injustices, even if true, cannot be used to overturn property rights that have been established for over a century. Mr. Morrison is an innocent purchaser who bought the land through proper legal channels. $10 is hardly what anyone would call a proper market transaction. Judge Reynolds observed dryly. The hearing lasted 3 days with expert witnesses testifying about treaty law, historical land practices, and the authentication of the documents. The most powerful moment came when Thomas took the stand to describe his family's connection to the land and his 15 years of caring for the burial sites. My great-great-grandfather Standing Bear didn't die defending this land because he was stubborn, Thomas testified, his voice steady and clear. He died because he knew that once you let people take what's rightfully yours through lies and violence, they'll never stop taking. Every generation that forgot that lesson lost a little more of who they were. When it was Jake's turn to testify, he surprised everyone, including himself, with what he said. Your Honor, I came here 6 months ago because I was desperate and homeless. I thought I was buying a place to live. But I learned something important from Mr. Crowfeather. Home isn't just about having a roof over your head. It's about belonging somewhere, about being part of something bigger than yourself. This land doesn't belong to me just because I have a piece of paper. It belongs to the people who loved it enough to die for it. On the final day of hearings, Richard Wells from Mountain Vista Development took the stand to defend his company's offer to purchase the property. He painted a picture of economic progress and job creation, arguing that developing the land would benefit the entire community. This property could support a resort that would employ hundreds of people and bring millions of tourist dollars to the region, Wells testified. Keeping it as a historical curiosity helps no one and benefits no one. But when Linda cross-examined him, Wells was forced to admit that his company had been aware of the disputed ownership when they made their offer. Even more damaging, he revealed that Mountain Vista had already begun purchasing surrounding properties, based on the assumption that they would eventually acquire the 40 acres. So you've been buying land and making promises to investors based on property you didn't actually own? Linda asked. We were confident that any legal complications could be resolved, Wells replied uncomfortably. Judge Reynolds recessed the court for 2 days to consider her decision. Jake and Thomas spent those 48 hours at the ranch, trying to keep busy while they waited for news that would determine their future. Whatever happens, Thomas said as they sat on the front porch on the second evening, I want you to know that these past 6 months have meant more to me than the previous 15 years combined. Having someone to share the burden with, someone who understood why this mattered, that's been a gift. Jake nodded, feeling the same way. I learned more about who I want to be from you than I learned in 34 years of stumbling around. On my own, when they returned to court for the judge's decision, the gallery was even more packed than before. Judge Reynolds took her time settling into her chair and reviewing her notes before she began to speak. This case has forced the court to confront some uncomfortable truths about how this nation has treated its indigenous peoples, she began. The evidence clearly shows that the original seizure of this land was accomplished through fraud and deception, in direct violation of treaty obligations. Jake felt his heart racing as the judge continued. However, the court must also consider the rights of Mr. Morrison, who purchased the property in good faith through legal channels. The fact that he paid only $10 suggests that even the county was aware of title problems, but that does not invalidate his status as an innocent purchaser. Thomas reached over and squeezed Jake's hand. They had prepared themselves for this moment, the possibility that the judge would have to choose between them. Therefore, Judge Reynolds continued, the court is ordering an innovative solution. The 40 acres in question will be placed in a special heritage trust. with Mr. Crowfeather designated as the cultural steward and Mr. Morrison as the legal resident and caretaker. The trust will be funded through a settlement with Mountain Vista Development, which has profited from purchasing surrounding properties based on fraudulent assumptions about their ability to acquire this land. The courtroom erupted in surprised murmurs. Jake and Thomas looked at each other in amazement. Furthermore, the judge added, raising her voice over the noise, the court is ordering the establishment of a small museum and cultural center on the property to be funded by the settlement and operated jointly by Mr. Crowfeather and Mr. Morrison. This will ensure that the true history of this land is preserved and shared with future generations. Wells from Mountain Vista Development was on his feet immediately. Your Honor, our company objects to any settlement that, Mr. Wells. Judge Reynolds interrupted. Your company has already admitted to purchasing property based on your assumption that you could acquire land you didn't own. The court considers this a form of fraud against your own investors. You can accept this settlement or you can face criminal charges for misrepresentation. Wells sat down quickly and began whispering frantically with his lawyers outside the courthouse. An hour later, Jake and Thomas stood together in the Montana sunshine, still trying to process what had happened. They had both won, but more importantly, the land had won. The burial sites would be protected, the history would be preserved, and two men who had started as adversaries had become partners in something larger than either imagined. So, we're going to run a museum together? Jake asked, still not quite believing it. Looks that way, Thomas replied with a smile. Think you can handle being a history teacher? I think I can learn, Jake said. I've had a pretty good teacher these past 6 months. As they walked down the courthouse steps together, Jake thought about the long journey that had brought them to this moment. He had come to Montana with $10 and no hope, looking for a place to hide from his failures. Instead, he had found a home, a purpose, and a friend who had taught him that some things were worth fighting for, no matter what the cost. The 40 acres of Montana wilderness where Standing Bear had made his last stand would continue to tell its story. But now it would tell the whole truth about betrayal and courage, about loss and redemption, and about two very different men who had found a way to honor the past while building something new for the future.